And beep boop. So, our topic for today is the civil rights classification system. This is not as fully written into stone and as clearly cut into tiered lists as our textbook or even these slides make it out to be. But these are the general sets of questions that the court system asks itself when asking, okay, is it okay is it okay for or legally permissible for a government policy to discriminate against a group? As we say at the beginning of chapter 15, lesson 5, laws do discriminate. Driver's license laws discriminate. But some forms of discrimination are seen permissible and others are not. Worth noting, while these are explicitly for governmental discrimination, the types of questions that we ask in here are very similar to the types of questions that would be asked in the event of a private business looking to discriminate or an individual looking to discriminate. I run a small business. I have a rental house that I rent out through Airbnb. If I were to discriminate against people who are under the age of 24, which I do, and I say, I don't know that I necessarily want 22-year-olds renting my place. I don't know that I trust them to be responsible with it. That's a fair form of discrimination, and the company that I work with through that is willing to implement that kind of discrimination. If I were to say, I don't want people who are of a certain country of origin, the company I work with would probably be like, whoa, we're going to get sued if we try that. So back off on that one. We can't have that as a policy. So these inform and lead some of the other forms of discrimination law. But what we're dealing with here is governmental discrimination and what the 14th Amendment say. Most of the other forms of discrimination law are governed then by things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or other policies, education amendments of 72, other policies that we'll talk about in chapter 15 of this lecture. Most of the time, when the government is making a law that discriminates against some sort of group of people, the only thing that they need to do is the first level of testing. Show that there is a rational basis for that discrimination. Government discriminates against people on the basis of age when it comes to voting or driving, and the courts have found that to be permissible. The government discriminates on the basis of income when setting tax brackets. The courts have found that to be permissible. Unless a group is explicitly protected under law, generally speaking, discriminations are rational basis discrimination. The government discriminates against people who have committed murder. That is a form of discrimination, but there is not a legal protection for murderers. Oh, there is, and we'll get to some in chapter 16. But, most of the time, rational basis law, we're in a weird situation here where rational basis law and rational basis tests makes up the vast majority of questions about the classification system, but it also is so uncontroversial and so easy to figure out that it doesn't really factor in to a lot of our reading or a lot of our notes or a lot of our historical landmark cases. The major questions come from the times where there is some sort of legal protection at play. Our two major tests then for when there are protections at play are the substantive relationship test and the strict scrutiny test. Starting off with substantive relationship, and we talked about this a little bit with our chapter 15 lesson 4 reading check, but the idea of a substantive relationship test, or sometimes called intermediate scrutiny by the court, is that if the government wants to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their sex, gender, sexual orientation, usually those are the things that we see fall under substantive relationship tests. that the government needs to show that the policy or distinction that they are implementing advances an important governmental purpose. The phrase there is important, and obviously, what is important is a relative term, but that is the phrase that then informs the court's judgment, and up to the court to decide what is an important governmental purpose. But then we get into what's probably the more easy to apply and more mechanical part of it. The government, and this is not well outlined, but the government and those who are accusing the government of discrimination share a burden of proof in these cases. So there is a mixed burden of proof between somebody who is accusing a government policy of being unconstitutional and the government to show that there is a that their policy is not discriminatory. This is in some ways an inversion of what we would think of with a criminal court, where it is entirely upon where we have so proven guilty as a standard. Here, if a government is accused of discrimination on the basis of sex, it isn't really oh, you have to prove that the government did it. It's up to both sides to convince the court that this discrimination either does or does not exist. A couple examples of places where a substantive relationship test has come in. My favorite one, which is not directly or not in any great length covered by our textbook, is the case of the Virginia Military Institute, because that is a very good one for showing how rational basis, strict scrutiny, and substantive relationship tests are all different. VMI is one of the nation's most elite military academies. VMI is run by the government, and VMI, up until the 1990s, was only accepting male cadets. Female applicants sued, saying that this was a discriminatory policy. The government's response was, well, there are plenty of military schools that do accept female cadets. VMI just isn't one. And made the case that the government made the case that there is an alternative available for females. Ultimately, in the court case, though, the court ruled that VMI is so elite and it is so good that you cannot say that military prep C is the equivalent of VMI, and therefore VMI cannot segregate on or cannot only accept male cadets, and they open up to potential female cadets. What this is here is it is ultimately, if we think about it in another way, saying that, oh no, separate but equal, well, it's a question of whether or not separate but equal, whether or not the Plessy versus Ferguson standard exists for segregation on the basis of gender, which by and large it does. If a school wants to say we offer men's basketball and girls basketball, or women's or boys and girls, depending on the appropriate sex character. If the school wants to say we offer men's and women's basketball, we say, okay, that is separate but equal, and therefore that is permissible. If they say, oh, we have BMI and Discount Military Institute, those are unequal and therefore unpermissible. With a substantive relationship, then, we see that it does fall then between a rational basis discrimination, which is relatively easy for a guy to do, but falls short of a strict scrutiny test. Did I have another thing to say there about substantive relationships? I don't believe so. The highest test and the most difficult test for a government to discriminate is when a government looks to discriminate on the basis of race, religion, or country of origin. In fact, it's so rare that we can go ahead and we can list the times that a governmental policy has survived the strict scrutiny test. in the event that the government wants to discriminate against people on the basis of their race, religion, country of origin, the government needs to do the following things. Number one, they need to show there is a compelling, which in legal speak is higher than important. They need to pretty much show that there is an existential governmental interest, that the government cannot continue to exist or is in some sort of perilous threat if it does not advance this interest, and that that interest is accomplished directly by this policy, and that this policy is, and this is where we get into some of the tricky parts, the least restrictive way of accomplishing that essential. Like I said, this is one where it's so rare that the government agree, or that the courts agree that a policy meets these criteria that we can pretty easily list the number of times that strict scrutiny test has been passed. And one of them, the courts have since gone back and said that they have gotten it, that they got it wrong. That is the 1944 case, which I'm sure you learned about in U.S. history, of Korematsu versus the United States, the case dealing with Japanese American internment in the United States. Japanese American citizens were obviously interned during World War II and put into internment camps. And in a 1944 case, the 1944 case of Fred Korematsu, the Supreme Court ruled, while having the strict scrutiny test in front of them, and while going through the steps of this strict scrutiny test, the Supreme Court said this is a compelling governmental interest. This policy accomplishes that governmental interest, and bizarrely says that putting Japanese Americans into internment camps is the least restrictive way of accomplishing the goal of national security. Almost all legal scholars since then look at that decision and say, "Whoa, that's not on that last criteria. That internment is, by definition, one of the more extreme measures, not one of the least restrictive measures possible." And in the last couple of decades, we have, or in the last decade or so, we have started to see that the court is formally backing away from that. In 2011, the Department of Justice came out and said, we no longer view this as a valid precedent. And the Department of Justice, who obviously would have been arguing for the United States back in 1944, even though it's entirely different people, the Department of Justice has now said, we are vacating our old argument. We would no longer stand for the internment of American citizens. And in 2018, Chief Justice John Roberts, in dealing with the case of Trump versus Hawaii, was one of the immigration cases, was looking at pretty much classification system question, was looking at discriminating against people on the basis of their country of origin. And in coming up with the ruling for that case, which actually wasn't a major case, the major thing that Chief Justice John Roberts did while writing for the court was he brought up the example of Korematsu and said, but the court should never rule based on Korematsu as a precedent. Yeah. That is completely invalid, and the court as a whole views that as a mistake. So strict scrutiny, it is very difficult for our government to discriminate against race, religion, or country of origin legally. Of the times that has happened, one of them, the court has been like, this is one of our worst mistakes ever. Because vacating a decision like that is almost unprecedented. So that brings us to, well, when can a government make a discrimination on the basis of race? And really, we get our answer at the end of of chapter 15, lesson 5, which was affirmative action case. When a government tries to make a discrimination with the goal of advancing the needs of equality or diversity, then sometimes the court rules differently, but not always. We saw in the case of Baxter that the court, at the end of chapter 15, 5, and we'll talk about this in our next lecture, that the court said, okay, no, you can't have a strict quota on minority students. But they did in the case of Grutter eventually, and Grutter is the only other major case where a policy has survived strict scrutiny, they told the University of Michigan, okay, some form of affirmative action can exist, but again, it's that last bullet point under strict scrutiny that becomes the sticking point. How do you implement an affirmative action policy in the way that is the least restrictive way possible? We'll go specifically over some affirmative action cases and affirmative action policies on Monday's class when we take a look at Chapter 15, Lesson 5, and talk a little bit about that in the lecture. But basically, in short, the court's policy on affirmative action cases has been they think that that affirmative action can exist legally and constitutionally, but almost every system that gets brought before the courts end up saying you can make that a little bit less restrictive. We would like to see that system reformed a little bit so it doesn't feel like it's disadvantaging, in the case of college admissions, white Americans and Asians. I put a short quote up here, an excerpt from the ruling in Ruder versus Bollinger, coming from Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the one who makes all of our eyes skin. She doesn't make our eyes skin because she's old and suffers from dementia, but she supports the idea of eyes skin. She is the theoretical founder of it. But in her ruling in Ruder versus Bollinger, it was they said that the policy does not prohibit the Constitution does not prohibit the narrowly tailored use of race inhibitions to further the compelling interest in obtaining the educational benefits that flow from a diverse society. I like pulling that quote because it shows exactly how the strict scrutiny test is used. Okay, is there a compelling interest? Yes. Schools fundamentally exist better when they are diverse. And the Constitution doesn't prevent schools from taking measures to make themselves more diverse, but those measures have to be narrowly tailored. What is a narrowly tailored measure? Most of the time, if the court sees any sort of specific measure in front of them, they say, oh, let's make that a little bit more narrow. And we'll get into it on Monday about how narrowly tailored and permissible affirmative action is a really weird and questionable area in U.S. law. These are not the only two types of cases that have survived with strict scrutiny. The other ones also deal with affirmative action and usually deal with hiring practices and contracting. But as our textbook brings up in Adarand Construction versus Pena at the end, for the most part, the U.S. does not participate in the U.S. government does not participate in affirmative action when it comes to hiring contractors or when it comes to U.S. government hiring practices. But there are some places where they have allowed local governments to do so, or state governments to do so, or private businesses to engage in affirmative action practices. But that's the topic for Chapter 15, Lesson 5, and our class on Monday. This is done bridging the gap between 15.4 and 15.5. I want us to talk about 15.5 next week, so no new reading homework over the weekend. I hope that you all have a nice weekend and take care of yourself and each other. In just a little bit, I will stop the recording and we can do any questions that you might have. But if you don't have any questions, peace and love and have a good weekend. And stop recording.